Hello everyone, and welcome to this breakout session on data sharing and data quality. My name is Jenny Tennyson and I'm Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute, as well as being the co-chair for Data Governance Working Group within the Global Partnership for AI. So just to set the scene a little bit for our discussion today, good data ethics and good data governance now incorporates making data available for others as well as restricting access to data. So it might mean, making sure that systems and processes and services have access to data. It might mean making sure that data is available for research purposes, or it might mean making data available as open data for anyone to access and use and share. But of course, making data more widely available, sharing data brings additional challenges to just using it inside your own organisation. You need to work out who else needs and can use data. And when you do that, then it's not just your own needs that you need to look after, it's also the needs of those other people. We need to be able to explain and understand and communicate around data quality. We also need to manage risks when others have access to data that we have and work through the kind of legal constraints we have around sharing data. Sometimes it can lead to challenges around business models. And in all of these cases, we have to balance the potential benefits of sharing data with the potential harms of what might happen when others get hold of it. And so to talk about this today, we first of all have a fireside chat between Chris and Simon, so which I'll introduce in a second, and then we're going to have a 45-minute panel which I'll be chairing. So please, sit back and enjoy this fireside chat for the next 15 minutes. Please keep your kind of camera and your microphone off to enable the Chris and Simon to chat. And I'll hand over now. So I'm happy to introduce Simon Persoff, who's a partner in Clifford Chance's tech team, and Chris James, who's head of digital legal for the UK and Europe at HSBC. And Simon and Chris will be talking about data sharing frameworks, the pandemic, and the role of the UK National Data Strategy. Over to you two.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks, Chris, for joining us in this virtual fireside chat. Looking back on the role of data sharing in the UK's response to the pandemic, do you feel that the current legal and organisational data sharing framework in the UK supported or hindered the country's efforts to deal with the pandemic?
Thanks, Simon. Well, you know me, I'm going to be a pedantic lawyer and answer that question with a question. And I'm going to ask, look, what is a data sharing framework? Clearly, there's a legal aspect to it, close to your heart and mind. But as the National Data Strategy calls out, there's also a technology aspect, a schema aspect, a data management aspect, a data governance aspect too. A holistic framework about managing data is really multidisciplinary. My perception, I guess, during the pandemic is that a lot of people did a lot of good work in very short order on a tactical basis. Did it feel like a framework? No, I don't think any of us in the midst of it felt like we were working to a framework. But I think it certainly from an outcome perspective, I think we achieved really what we were trying to achieve. I don't want to understate kind of specific individual experiences, and there were some areas that didn't, where certainly the framework, I think, particularly from a legal perspective, potentially was a hindrance. The lack of ethnicity data in underlying data sets, for example, is well known to have made it difficult to analyse why certain groups were disproportionately affected. So there are certainly some individual questions that deserve more scrutiny, but I think areas of governance that might be perceived as barriers, areas of the framework that maybe didn't work quite as well as everybody might have expected, for example, privacy laws, do exist to protect rights, including minority rights, and kind of interacting in different and potential unanticipated ways in novel situations is par for the course. We need to apply constant scrutiny. We need to make sure we're getting the balance right there. But I think overall, was the framework successful? Not sure. We really had a framework as such, but tactically, I think we were successful in what we tried to achieve.
Picking up on one point specifically there, you mentioned privacy law and its role. Indeed, during the pandemic, privacy issues were given quite prominent focus, and certainly when it came to things like app design, which entered the public psyche in terms of conversation topics. But do you feel that perhaps privacy concerns were considered less of a priority compared to, for example, stopping the proliferation of the virus? And do you think we'll discover consequences of widespread data sharing in years to come?
Good question. I think the law held up. Privacy lawyers have never been busier. I think many of us were right in the thick of it at all levels, in-house, law firms, regulator, governments, giving real substantive advice. I think the crisis gave the impetus to a lot of organizations to move organizational technical barriers to certain data sharing activities out the way. For example, to create lists of people who are shielding it comes to mind. And of course, to then share those with both public and private sector. And I think, so certainly there was a lot of work done there on the technical and organizational side, but I think the privacy side actually, in most cases, enabled those types of initiative. I think it's there to protect individuals, to enable, but also to protect them. For example, by making sure that that kind of data, that list of vulnerable people isn't later, isn't now, as we're coming, hopefully, fingers crossed, out of a pandemic next year, is then not misused for other unwelcome purposes. And as you say, I think the fact that people were talking about some of the technical issues and the apps and the different types of apps and whether it's centralized or decentralized data collection, those are the kind of things that you and I, Simon, talk about very regularly, but I'm not sure entered the public consciousness until this year. I think it's good to have given privacy law, certainly GDPR, a bit more weight in the national consciousness beyond just managing email opt-outs.
Great. I mean, looking forward, so now and in the future, the government's recently published its draft national data strategy, and do you think it will help? And the very little information that's currently available, but do you think it will help respond to some of the challenges that we've identified so far in our fireside chat, and more broadly that were posed by the pandemic?
Yeah, I think it's a great time to be looking at a more strategic approach to data as a country. They say the pandemic has hastened the transition to a digital economy, don't they, by 3 to 5 years? And I think therefore dealing with that, managing that on a strategic basis is the right thing to do. Yeah, I do think we need to be a bit careful to understand the detail, particularly how it will help citizens and businesses first and foremost. And I think we're really just at the start of that. Within that, I think it's really important that it's led by specific requirements of business and customers and governments and citizens. We've seen time and time again that creating data schema for the sake of data schema, it just doesn't really take off, and data integration is very hard to get right. And so, yes, cautious optimism, provided we nail the detail.
Talking about detail, can you give some kind of practical examples of what you'd like to see?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think beyond the obvious, which I'll say it anyway, making sure we know what we want to share and why. I think we also need to look on the impact that the sharing has on things like competition in markets, on liability of organizations asked to share data, on consumer protection, on protecting people from misuse of their data, on dealing with things like proprietary and confidential information, and making sure as a country we can protect our important intellectual property, making sure the user experience works, making sure it's actually relevant and can compete with perhaps companies that are putting less open initiatives out into the market. As a lawyer, let me pick one of these that's close to my heart, and that's intellectual property rights. It's a complex topic and it's not always very well understood. The question of when it's appropriate to use data, when it's appropriate to share data, how we compensate people who have created the data, how we compensate people who have gone to put effort into maintaining the data. These are all details that's just one area of complexity of many that we really have to dig into to be able to really enable open data at scale.
Agreed. Just to add one more to the list, which is managing repurposing of the data and making sure that you open the Pandora's box, data shared, you have some element of control over what's done with it. But I think you're right in terms of issues like intellectual property, competition, and of course the big one of liability, which will no doubt keep us all in jobs for years to come. But all of those need answers. So how do we get to that level of detail?
I think we have to do it at a use case level. In financial services, we've had some experience through open banking, and I don't want to get too much into the pros and cons of that specific example, but it's clear that we can take lessons from existing open data initiatives and share those. It would be great to see more open banking style initiatives across different sectors for the benefit of consumers and businesses alike, at a use case by use case level.
Interesting. And in fact, the National Data Strategy document itself talks of legal barriers to data sharing, which it describes as real or perceived, which is an interesting comment. What do you think it was meant by that?
Yeah, I love that comment. That is very, very telling. I think people do really struggle with the legal aspect of it. I think that people who are interested in open data can tend to solve the technical and organizational issues, but then hit a bit of a barrier when they're dealing with the legal issues like the IP law issue that I just mentioned. But I think another example is the data privacy area that you and I, again, we speak about often. Things like sharing data to help fight crime or for health reasons, things where we might say, well, we can't get consent for that, so how do we share it? The complexity means that people see it as a barrier. I think it's the perception of that we can't navigate through this forest of complexity that's the problem, and sometimes you get the easy answer, sorry, GDPR means we can't do this, or the contract doesn't let us do that, and often they're not quite the full answers that they could be. Sometimes there are ways and means, but we're dealing with unusual or unanticipated scenarios, and we need to work through that complexity. I think that I'm not justifying that. I think if something is vital, like in a pandemic, to protect a fundamental right like health, being as absolutely clear as we can be about the fact that that thing is permitted under law is really something we should strive for. And I think there's always room to take lessons learned and improve on that.
Indeed, one of the least developed aspects of the GDPR is data sharing. Unless data is going outside the European Economic Area, then a transfer from a controller to a controller is only subject to the lightest touch regulation, such as just confirming that the purpose of processing is broadly compatible. Do you think the UK may, in its national data strategy, consider putting together a framework on dealing with these points?
I think that would be useful. When you look back at ICO enforcement, clearly this has been an issue in multiple cases, and as I say, nailing additional clarity and putting everybody on an equal footing, it is provided as a right, of course, is a laudable objective. I think the corollary is we can't possibly legislate for every possible innovation that could come out of the use of open data, and it's really therefore important to apply an ethical lens as well over the use of that data.
Yeah,
and I think
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, this is a series of talks around ethics. I'm interested in your view of the role of ethics in the evolution of open data and data sharing, and particularly through the lens of the fact that individuals might not fully understand why their data is being shared and the purposes for it's being shared, and what we ought to do to address that.
It's hopefully it's a real opportunity to address that through the the national data strategy and through institutions and businesses and organisations' own work on data ethics. People, people do, rightly worry about how their data will be used if it falls into the wrong hands. Making data more open increases potentially their worry surface. The amount of potential misuse of data that could happen. But I think we oughtn't. I do think doing so ethically is really important. But and applying ethical principles to things like AI, to things like big data, absolutely at the forefront of everybody's mind when we do this, and must remain so. But I don't think we should lose sight of the possible benefits of data sharing. Being able to pull data into different systems, different industries, being able to kind of take advantage of the synergies. I think that's really critical. It certainly excites me as a bit of a geek to be able to do that myself. But even for people who don't want to get down and dirty with APIs, I think it's the potential for new and innovative use cases that we really should focus on, and how to make sure we're acting ethically, but not lose sight of the excitement and the possibility.
Well, certainly the national data strategy does envisage data sharing being a positive thing, and I think most individuals would probably think it's good as well. Take your person on the list of extremely critically vulnerable individuals, which is the highest level of risk category in COVID terms. Those individuals benefited by having their personal data shared with agencies that provided a food parcel to them on a frequent basis, and to the supermarkets that were able to prioritize slots so that these people didn't need to go out to a supermarket in person and shop. And then you've got to balance that against the fact that there will be an expectation of these individuals that their insurance companies or other organizations won't be able to get hold of that fact that they're on that list, or any other third party in a way that wouldn't act in their interest. So I think that balance between the potentially conflicting objectives of the national data strategy, on the one hand to protect personal data, and on the other hand to encourage data sharing in the interest of everyone, is, I think, going to be the key issue for the national data strategy to deal with. And on that note, our time's now up. Chris, thank you very much for sharing your views. I think, Jenny, I'm going to pass back to you now.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Chris. That's a really interesting discussion. So I'll ask you to hide yourselves now. And for the panelists, for Stephen, Sam, Rachel, Arnav, can you show yourselves as well? Thank you so much. So we'll now move on to the panel session. For those of you that have just joined, my name is Jenny Tennyson, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute. And we're having a panel about data sharing and data quality. In the panel, we're going to be discussing what public, private, third sector organisations should be doing in order to ensure that the data that they hold and steward is actually supporting wider good. And I've got a whole bunch of questions that I've lined up and the panel already know and have prepared for, but I'd love to have some questions from you, the audience, as well, to really keep them on their toes. So please do, as we start speaking, put in any questions that you have into the chat, and we may come to you or I'll read them out. Thank you. Right, so first I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Lovely cat, Rachel. Could you just give us a quick introduction to each of yourselves, and I want you to answer the question: when you think about organisations sharing or opening data, what's the kind of first thing that comes to your mind as either an example of something good or something bad, and something that you'd like to highlight? So Stephen, you first.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Doherty, and my role is Industry Executive for Health at Microsoft. I'm a former NHS CIO, so most of my points will be focused around healthcare. I've seen many great examples of data sharing, and I would like to point out that over the last few years, we've seen some areas around the country that have created what's known as shared care records. So these shared care records, they bring data together from different NHS organisations, as well as local authorities who provide social care. So they are not everywhere today, but they are evolving. And as our health and social care sector reconfigures itself into what we call integrated care systems, or ICSs. So the need to join up data and develop population health management capabilities is paramount. So to call out a specific example that's happening now, and Simon mentioned something similar to it in his chat earlier, Frimley Health and Care, which is one of the first designated integrated care systems in England, they brought data together from multiple organisations and care settings. So as a result, they're able to monitor COVID activity, so those confirmed cases at home, and admissions to hospital, and those that are at high risk of severe outcomes if they contract COVID. And now they're getting an understanding into how the working age population has been affected by COVID and the effects on physical and mental health. So of course, this is only possible if the relevant organisations come together and join up the relevant data. So this is why it matters that we get it right.
Forgot to unmute as usual. Thanks very much, Stephen. Sam.
Thanks, Jenny, and hi everyone. I'm Sam. I'm the head of open data at GDS, part of Cabinet Office. So some examples to call out from recent times, which I think are worth kind of raising. One is around grants data. So I'd like to pay tribute to my colleagues in the Cabinet Office. They've recently been able to publish £32 billion worth of grants data to the 360 Giving Standard, which is a fantastic project and one that's taken about 3 years to actually realise. So a really fantastic achievement and something that I'm sure will produce lots of insight and measurable kind of outcomes in future. Second thing to mention is a project that the LGA have been working on, which is around loneliness. So it's around publishing data from local service providers to help people that are suffering from loneliness access services that might help them. So very much social prescribing, and a really fantastic kind of benchmark. And then finally, some work from DFT around the open data for buses. So we talk about the TfL example all the time in open data circles. This is kind of the bus equivalent of that. So they've been working with providers of local transport to create standards again and publish data in a way that people can access. And I wanted to call out those 3 examples because they represent the use of standards, but they also represent like meaningful outcomes for people. So those are like 3 nice examples of how open data can help people every day.
Thanks, Sam, and love it that those were proper open data examples, so data anyone can access, use and share. Rachel, good or bad examples? And introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Rachel, and I have a cat who is absolutely determined to be a part of this. So until about a year ago, I was the CEO of .everyone, which you may remember, and I'm now doing mostly independent policy work, but I'm also on the Ofcom content board, and so I have like a little bit of a perspective of how to think about these things from a community role through to a more regulatory one. And I suppose like the thing that I think about is that when data is shared, what I'm most interested in is the reason it's shared and the purpose. And that I think a lot of the time we think that that like if we have more data, it's possible to know more. But sometimes when you add data that is maybe shared out of context or used for different reasons, it can actually end up not telling the whole story. And there's something I came across a couple of months ago, which is, I think this is a research project in ONS, and it's still research, but this is a project that is bringing together data about education with data out of the Ministry of Justice, and it's in total, I think, bringing together 31 different data sets to understand the possibility of children to turn into offenders. And this is even though the Ministry of Justice have admitted that the data is really likely to over-index and over-reflect people of black and minority ethnic groups. And the educational data has been collected to understand the performance of the schools. So it's kind of, this is an example where I guess for me, it feels like lots of data that probably oughtn't go together is put together, and it probably doesn't tell us anything we really need to know.
Thank you, Rachel. And finally, Arnav, introduction and an example of data openness or sharing, either good or bad.
Sure, thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. My name's Arnold. I'm a senior associate at in the Clifford Chance tech practice. I have a background sort of in this field as a lawyer in data protection, cybersecurity, and also digital ethics, and I lead the firm's working group on data ethics. I think in terms of sort of what comes to mind immediately when thinking of data sharing and open data, as opposed to and it's a good thing everyone's muted, because I'm about to use a very overused phrase, which is to say that sort of with great power comes great responsibility, especially for the sorts of large organizations that many of us either come from or represent very often. I think that's great responsibility to first and foremost protect, but also increasingly and in increasing context to share. Of course, there's a much wider question about what is the underlying basis for some of the power that these organizations have, but that's a whole other question to be addressed perhaps at another time. As good and bad examples, I would say, I think given that we're sort of just hopefully at the tail end of a global pandemic, there's some really good and bad examples just from this experience. I think starting right from the non-personal data potentially side of things, so open access research information that got us to identify things like the virus and lead to sort of coming up with researchers and academics all over the world being able to come up with solutions to it, all the way through to, I think Simon mentioned from a UK context, retailers and grocery services being able to share their data to make sure that people who are shielding or isolating, etc., were able to get things to them on time. I think as a bad example, or one that I'm still not 100% convinced on, is the whole thing of all of these various contact tracing practices that we've come up with. You ranging all the way from Hong Kong, where you have to wear a bracelet and share that data with government, to the sort of Apple versus Google debate and centralized versus decentralized. I'm still not 100% sure that that achieves anything, and I think a lot of research has been done to show that it's not necessarily had a huge impact, nor do I think it's necessarily been done right. So we would have thought that going into this we had the right legal frameworks, the right technology, and then it sort of all unraveled when we had to do it under pressure.
Thanks, Arno. One thing that I wanted to kind of dig into as part of my kind of hypothesis is that we so often talk about like good data governance, good data ethics as being about stopping harms. And there is this kind of flip side about enabling benefits, right? And so one quite kind of question in my mind is, are there any times when it's actually when you would view it as unethical not to share data, when like there's an ethical drive to do that sharing or do that openness? And Rachel, maybe we can come to you first. It's okay to say no, by the way.
Sorry. Yeah. I think I'll start actually by just picking up on the data about people who were shielding, because that does actually pose a number of interesting ethical problems, not least the fact that people were designated as vulnerable, and that was not within their control. So it's quite, you know, although that is extremely handy from a large system perspective, actually in those thousands and thousands of people, there were lots of individual differences and reasons that meant that maybe didn't help them, you know. And so I think it's really important to think about here and understand that actually we probably have to balance an understanding between what the main stream impacts are and the impacts of any kind of data sharing to people who have either protected characteristics or the assemblages of those. And I think, you know, the other thing is there's a really interesting kind of problem here about when is it okay not to innovate? You know, when is it okay not to try new things? When is it okay to be thinking about maintaining and looking after? Because I think it's very easy to get a lot of momentum behind newness, and it's a lot harder to be looking back and improving things. And so I think I would say, you know, if you are the sharing data, you have to be aware of the consequences, of the context, the constraints, and be willing and able to mitigate those. You know, I don't think it's always good in all circumstances.
Thanks, Rachel. So, I mean, the real thing there is kind of understanding what the consequences might be around sharing data and kind of weighing it up on a case-by-case basis. So, Arnav, do you have anything that you'd like to add on that question?
No, I think I agree with that point of view, especially the one around should we be innovating and the question of should you be doing something just because you can be doing it. I think, again, just to contextualize back to the pandemic, that's a question that a lot of organizations would have been asking themselves. And this is something that Simon and I had been discussing a few days earlier as well. And I'd actually be really keen to hear the panel's thoughts on this as well, is that there are a lot of safeguards when we talk about this from a legal perspective. The GDPR, sort of personal data safeguards in Europe, is a principles-based legislation. A lot of the things that we're meant to sort of weigh when we're sharing data and processing data, doing new types of things, are left, you know, in many ways for us to consider from the context of people's rights and freedoms. I know that there's been other stressful moments in our history where when we've been faced with challenges like this, whether that's war or others, it's sort of spurred innovation and got people to do lots of new things and do them right, potentially, arguably. I'm not sure where we've landed on that just yet. I think it will only really know a few years from now whether some of the decisions which will now sort of be set, maybe for quite a few people, be set in stone, whether those were the right decisions by law and by sort of ethics and doing right by the data that we've now probably already shared.
And of course, there's this thing, isn't there, that the things that we put in place during emergency situations often don't get rolled back. They set a new kind of bar, and we have to be aware of that. Sam, what about you? When's it not ethical to not share?
It's a great question. I think echoing what's already been said. I think just to kind of put a different spin on it, I think you're right about the crisis situation and things being opened up. I think one of the things though that we see a lot is this calling back to what was said in the fireside chat at the beginning. There's this issue around barriers, real and perceived, I think was the phrasing in the NDS, National Data Strategy. And I think that during a crisis situation like the one we're in, it focuses several different kind of sectors on this issue. So you've got the normal kind of state of play is that the private sector is focused on its things. Government is focused on a number of different outcomes all the time, and actually getting different people to speak to each other for sort of like I guess coordinated kind of outcomes, things that are mutually beneficial can be difficult. It can be a difficult conversation, and due to all the things that we've talked about so far, there is a reticence to go ahead and do things, even if they're legal, even if they're okay to do, even if they are ethically permissible. If you look at the data ethics framework and things of that nature, even if they're okay, there's still a cultural reticence to do stuff because of that perception that maybe they shouldn't. And I think that what's interesting about what we've seen this year with the COVID pandemic is that we are all focused on dealing with this pandemic, and that actually enables quite a few things to happen that otherwise would take a lot longer to happen. And I think that it's important to not only kind of be very careful and scrutinize what is being decided and what decisions are being made, but also to kind of look at some of the outcomes that have been kind of born out of this crisis situation, and also look at the pace at which things have happened. And I think that's actually something that going forward is an interesting and I guess enabling factor that can show actually in some cases data sharing is a good thing, and that we should go ahead and do these things, and only in a moment where everyone is focused on a single outcome is this actually possible to happen. So that's my take.
I think one of the things it kind of sparks off for me is that one of the reasons I think for the reticence is that we've experienced that a lot of the side effects that might come from data access or data sharing are things that we can't guess at from where we are right now, and so there's a kind of we don't know what harm might come, and that means that we have to build in, I think, extra kinds of protections in order to give us more confidence, and also to be able to react when those things happen. But listen, there's a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to those rather than my pre-prepared list, and we'll see where that takes us. So we've got a question. Thanks, Chris, for reframing your observation as a question. Who asks, how do we make the debate focus more on data sovereignty? In other words, encouraging individuals to share data in their own and society's interests. And one thing I'd just highlight around this is the new Data Governance Act out of the European Commission, which includes this idea of data altruism, right? The idea that individuals might take data that's about them and donate it to societal good. Any thoughts from the panel? Anybody want to pick that up as a notion?
Yeah, I could probably pick that one up. I think what's interesting here is that, coming back to the health, I'm always going to reflect upon that. So with these integrated care systems and bringing data together, right? So today's model, we treat the sick, right? Tomorrow's model, we keep people well. Now, in order to do that, there's a whole journey that needs to take place for us to get there. So having the right amount of data from people, and if people contribute data towards that, then you start to understand these determinants of health and the population. Once you can start to understand the determinants of health, you can start to make interventions. Once you start to make interventions, you can start to think about predictions. And then when you get into predictions, your prevention. So it's a long journey towards that. So I'd encourage the debate that if we can get people to consent to giving data towards, the optimization of care pathways and for research as well, then, this is the way forward.
And if I could just really quickly come in there as well, I think one is to take a slightly different view to this. I think there's a lot of data altruism that we're all engaging in without really knowing. So that's one point I'd make on what getting to a point where we fully understand what it is we are sharing to begin with. And to Stephen's point, not to take away from that at all, I think in the medical community, that's something that is fairly well established. It's also a great example of where people can and should be sharing more data, but in most other contexts, which is, as we know, is becoming increasingly complex, you know, the things that govern our day-to-day lives and so many of the decisions that are made about us are already being made. And I think in that sense, the altruism needs to come from the people that maintain that infrastructure, that are sort of gathering and using that data for all sorts of purposes, and whether it's time for them to think about where they, you know, pick up on that cause and then sort of do more with the data that they already have about all of us.
Go, Rachel.
And I'd add that actually, I suppose, building on that, there needs to be the trust and the transparency, and so the thing that very often happens, I think, to Arnold's point, is that the data that goes in and we don't get any feedback. Like it isn't clear to us how our data is used, and that I think in research I've done previously looking at public attitudes, I think certainly people actually reluctantly have more trust in business to look after their data in a way that they would think is appropriate than they do in a government. And so actually, in order to strengthen that, I think there needs to be really sort of purposeful engagement rather than the expectation that the data that we're creating, you know, that there's a right for it to be used in other contexts. And like I've spoken previously about the need to kind of update a social contract, and that actually, you know, there's loads of parts here, and there's loads of good, but there's appropriate nervousness too.
Yeah, and for me, one of the things there is the kinds of different if we're relying on people's altruism to make data available for particular purposes, then we're also relying on their ability to make those choices, the time that they have to make them, and therefore we're likely to only be getting the kind of participation from some subset of our population when we need to be thinking about everyone. So those are the kinds of things that come in my mind too. We've got a question from Adam Donnelly, who's really interested, I think, Rachel, in your example around the use of data in justice that you spoke about. So was there anything that you had to expand on that, or other people on the call?
Like I'd add, I mean, just there was a report that the Ministry of Justice published, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, where actually, you know, they're really clear that there are big gaps in the data. And I think actually, just looking at Adam's question, I remember it was really interesting in the phrase, right? It's like, actually, if you want to reduce harm, you know, I would say, and this is totally out of my field of expertise, that you improve education, jobs, you know, you address the root cause of it rather than look to technology. And I think that this is kind of the problem, that sometimes we bring technology in as an instrumental thing rather than actually changing the source of the issue overall.
Thanks, Rachel. And another question from the participants. So in the case of data sharing, we're often talking about corporations owning the data to share as they are holding most of the data. Does data ownership need to be rethought as well? Anybody want to give a comment on data ownership? Arnav, you look like you've unmuted.
Sure, and I'm sure everyone will have views on this. I think so there's a reason that the laws that we have sort of move away from the concept of data ownership. So it's data about an individual, not data owned by that individual. I think most data controllers may, have in practice that there's a slightly different sense to this, where someone who may own a particular data set and do lots of great work to sort of build the infrastructure that maintains it, apply lots of protections that we've come to expect and that the law expects of them, and then innovate based on the data that they hold. That said, it's still very much data about me as an individual, and if anyone were to be said to be owning that data and have be able to decide what should be done, can and should be done with it, it should be me. I think as corporations go, there's more to be done by way of transparency to start with, just so that when before that data is collected and then further on the life cycle, whatever's done with it, there should be greater transparency and control around that. We're still in early stages of figuring out best practices on what that means, both at a technical level and the sort of paper layer, as it were. But yeah, I would just say that it's not for them to own that data, but it's for them to be more clear about what the individual can do with it, and then for us to get to a place where users have more agency in relation to what's done with that data.
Thanks, Arnav. I'm assuming from lack of unmuting that nobody else wants to come in on this question. So I'm going to move us to kind of questions about what government should be doing around around data sharing. So obviously government has this role to play to make sure that data is being shared and opened appropriately. That like applied to both the data that government holds, but also the data that is like out there in the whole of the rest of the data ecosystem. And the National Data Strategy obviously has something to say about that. But Sam, can we come to you first? So, as our government representative, what would you like to shout about in terms of what government is doing in order to make sure that data is shared and opened appropriately?
Sure. I mean, I think first of all, the key thing to say is appropriate. So I think Rachel's mentioned already, we need to make sure that we're sharing for a purpose and a clear purpose. So we introduced the Digital Economy Act 2017. The codes and regs came in 2018. That enables data to be shared for a number of kind of key outcomes, one of which is around improving public service. So, helping offer public services to people that need them. So I think there's work in that nature that's been going on that I think is really, really important, and we're working more closely with departments and agencies to ensure that work is happening across the board. Again, just because you make a legal gateway, it doesn't mean that people will straight away start to use it. So it's something that, again, that we need to work with people to help them understand the possibilities in that space. But also more broadly than that, I think there's a lot of work happening around data standards and around kind of making sure that access to data is more possible. These are things that the National Data Strategy do mention. They're things that we're working on, and obviously the consultation closes this Friday, so we'll see if there are other suggestions that come from that consultation. But we know that things like data availability, we know that there are a number of great pieces of work that are happening around things like regulation and regulatory data sharing. These are all things that can help, I guess, improve the efficiency of government, improve kind of public trust in government, and also create more efficient ways of working and value for money, I guess, for the way that government operates. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at. But it also needs to be said that, when it comes to personal data, that really is a special case, and that's something that we are not necessarily talking about when we're talking about, every kind of data share that happens. A lot of times it's organizational data. A lot of times it's what we call exhaust data, so data that is collected as part of other service delivery. So I say those are kind of a snapshot of some of the things that we're working on, but we will see what happens with the National Data Strategy consultation, and I'm sure there'll be an interesting set of requirements and recommendations that come from the back of that on Friday.
Thanks, Sam. I think it's actually closing today because we had a 1-week extension, but I think it's 11:45 p.m. tonight, I believe, for your National Data Strategy consultation responses. So, Stephen, to come to you, is there anything that you would like to see government doing in order to enable a better data sharing environment?
Yeah, I think so. I think the National Data Strategy and the consultation is absolutely timely. given where we are, because then with the consultation, we'll get a diverse range of stakeholders that can contribute towards that. And I think one of the key things for me around the health and social care side of things is is data standards and interoperability of data. So Sam mentioned that around data standards. So this is really important because it's well known today that today's frontline staff, they've got multiple disparate systems that they have to log on to. They have to deal with the different sources of information. They spend more time on systems than they do with citizen patients. So I think having core data standards for the exchange and interoperability of health information is really important, because this will support the forming of shared care records. And so some of the work that's already been done by NHSX and the Professional Standards Records Body will help. And if health and care organisations and industry, this is important, can adopt fast healthcare interoperability resources, FHIR standards as an exchange, then the whole health and social care sector will benefit ultimately.
Cool, brilliant, thanks.
Sorry, if I could just add a really quick technical point there on something that I've not really seen much of, and I know a lot of people out there have been expecting it, which is, I tend to be slightly skeptical of when people say, as I think Sam was mentioning, the distinction between personal and non-personal data. I think it's very easy it's a very, very thin line. And in terms of data that can be shared and what it could be combined with, to very easily make turn that into personal data is a very thin line. In that sense, there's a lot more in terms of technical protections that do need to be applied over the data as it's increasingly shared. What I've not seen a huge amount of effort from the government or the ICO and others is guidance in terms of what the future of things like standards around anonymization techniques and others look like. There's a lot of that's happened in the last few years alone on things in fields like multi-party computation or differential privacy and others. We've seen differential privacy as an example being used in the US election at scale, which is a massive exercise, really positive as well. But I've not seen enough done here in the UK along those lines, and it'd be really good to see what their plan of action is in coming up with sort of better guidance and standards on what does and does not work in different contexts.
Yeah, I really take your point about the kind of personal, non-personal lines not actually being helpful, especially when you're thinking about the ethical impact of the use of data as well. I mean, one of the things that I've been really impressed by recently is the work that's been going on in India around the data governance of non-personal data, and really thinking deeply about the way in which that can also affect communities, and therefore needs this deeper kind of data governance and data ethics considerations. It's not just personal data that can be sensitive and harmful. Rachel, what would you like to see government doing?
I guess there's two things. The first is, there has to be a vision. There has to be a vision for the kind of world we're interested in living in, not just a list of data sets that are able to be joined up, and I think that it's kind of really odd, because I think we're in this sort of weird moment where there's a huge amount of optimism and ambition about technology, but it's all like the ambition, or the scale of the ambition of it is too perfunctory, and so I suppose on the one hand there's vision, and on the other there's actually, I would really like to see engagement with communities who are likely to be either underrepresented or overrepresented or badly represented in the data sets, and to address that urgently, because actually if we continue with data that reflects the bias of the last 100 years, then I don't think we're going to be making progress. We're actually going to be sticking in the past. And so both kind of vision here and practical work on the ground.
Brilliant, thanks Rachel. So I'm going to do a quick whiz round the panel for a kind of final question and final thoughts. And I suppose, you know, I'm aware that many of the people that are kind of in the audience are going to be in organisations that have some data that could share it, could open it. What's if they are in that kind of situation, what's the one piece of advice that you would give to them around what they should do with the data that they hold in order to make it work really for everyone? Shall we go to you first, Stephen? One piece of advice.
I think key for me is that, you know, we can use data safely to combat health inequalities and help marginalised communities to access the services, then I think that's us going in the right direction. So I think that's the key thing for me. Thanks,
Stephen. Arnav.
I think going back to where I started, my key advice would be to, yes, again, it's a positive step. And when you do collect and aggregate huge amounts of data, I think increasingly organizations should and do have the responsibility to share it in the right contexts. That may be sharing for primarily not, and I should add, not necessarily for their own benefit, although that could be incidental, but for the benefit of the people who that data is about and wider society. I think there's some of the work that's being done in this space by, for example, all of the great work that the ODI is doing, some of the work that the National Data Strategy is hoping to do can be expanded out. But I would leave sort of my note of caution is that in my experience, when people have tried to be over adventurous with open data practices, that has blown up in their faces. So there's a little bit more to be done, I think, on the technical and guidance side of things from the ICO and others from a personal data perspective before I think people should get too adventurous in this space.
Thanks, Arnav. Rachel.
I would say to understand that there's almost nothing that is good for everyone, and that actually it's worth understanding who you're choosing as the beneficiary and who you are allowing to be whatever the opposite of a beneficiary is, and to mitigate that as appropriate.
Excellent, thank you. And Sam.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think for me, it's all about the ethics. Think about the ethical ramifications of what you're doing. Think about the public perception of what you're doing as well. I think that there is a section of things that are legally acceptable, and there is a separate section of things that are publicly acceptable, and those things are not the same thing. So I think it's really important to consider how what you're doing is going to be perceived, how it's going to affect people, as Rachel says, and also just to really think clearly at every stage of that process, at every stage of that project, what those different effects might be, because they will shift as a project is delivered. So I think that's just, I would say, look at the data ethics framework, look at the data ethics canvas, and really kind of be conscious of those things.
Thanks very much, Sam. And I suppose one thing that I would add is work with other people, because I think that, you know, often when we're sharing data, when we're opening data, then it's all about partnership and enabling others. And so being with understanding what other people's need and other organizations' needs are, and also working with partners who might be able to open up the same kind of data or share the same kind of data or data that's complementary is going to give you a much bigger kind of impact than just working alone. So that would be my tip, since taking chair's privilege to say that. So we're like 1 minute away from the end. Thank you so much to my panel for that really interesting discussion. Thank you to the people who have been watching for your interesting questions as well.